A chimpanzee, one of the smartest animals alive, stares at two overturned cups. A hand points at one of them. The chimpanzee hesitates, then guesses. It's wrong. A wolf, hand raised since birth, faces the same simple test. It fails too. Then a puppy is set down. 9 weeks old. It can barely walk in a straight line. The hand points. The puppy doesn't hesitate. It runs straight to the food.
Something in this animal reads us instantly, in a way nothing else on Earth quite does. Not chimpanzees, not wolves, only dogs. Where did this ability come from? And exactly how far does it go? In 2002, researchers Brian Hare and Michael Tomasello at the Max Planck Institute built a simple test. Hide food under one of 2 cups. Point to the right one. Watch what the animal does with that information. Dogs and puppies, barely weeks old, passed almost immediately, again and again across dozens of trials. Wolves and chimpanzees, tested the very same way, performed no better than chance. This wasn't a question of raw intelligence. Wolves are formidable problem solvers, on their own terms. It was something else, something closer to comprehension. Dogs seemed to grasp that the gesture was meant for them. Hare called it a kind of social genius, wired into dogs from a startlingly young age. Not every scientist agrees the ability is purely written into the genes, though. Some think it's written into a life. Researcher Monique Udell has argued that wolves, raised with enough human contact, can eventually learn to follow a point too. If that's true, the gap may not be pure biology. It may be something closer to upbringing. Which raises the next question. What is a dog actually reading in that gesture? If a dog turns to a human for answers, does it matter which human it turns to? In a series of studies at Eötvös Loránd University, researchers set up a simple choice. 2 people, 1 task. Only one of them had actually seen where the food was hidden. The informed human had watched the food being placed. The uninformed human had been sent out of the room, blindfolded, or simply looking the other way at the crucial moment. Both then pointed or gestured toward a container, one correctly, one guessing. Dogs often favored the person who had seen the food being hidden, suggesting they were sensitive to who had visual access to the event. Not by scent alone, but by tracking who was present, who was watching, and who wasn't at the exact moment that mattered. Some researchers see this as simple gaze tracking, repeated enough times to look like judgment. Others describe it as sensitivity to who had access to the relevant information. Either way, the pattern holds. A dog doesn't just search a face. It appears to distinguish between different human sources of information. Which raises a harder question still. If a dog can sense who was paying attention, can it also sense a gesture meant specifically for it before a single word is spoken? In 2012, at Eötvös Loránd University, researchers Erno Teglaus and Ottomo Miklasi asked a sharper question. Not whether dogs follow a gaze, but whether they know when it's meant for them. Human infants, long before they can speak, already understand the difference between a glance that's simply wandering and one meant to communicate something. A look preceded by eye contact. A look paired with a voice, speaking directly to them. Scientists call this an ostensive cue, a signal that says, in effect, this is for you. Teglaus and his team tested whether dogs noticed that same difference. When a person made eye contact first, then turned to look at something, dogs followed that gaze with far more attention than when the same head turn came without any greeting at all. In other words, a dog isn't simply tracking movement. It's quietly asking a question first. Was that glance meant for me? This is the mechanism scientists call joint attention. 2 minds, briefly aligned on the very same object, aware that they are both looking. Outside of dogs, this skill is almost unheard of in the animal kingdom. Even our closest primate relatives rarely manage it with such ease. Some researchers caution against reading too much into it. Recognizing a communicative signal is not the same as understanding another mind's intentions. Still, the pattern is hard to shake. Somewhere in that split-second decision, a dog seems to already know it's being spoken to.
If a dog can read a glance, can it also learn a name? In 2004, a border collie named Rico gave scientists an answer they didn't expect. Rico, tested by researcher Julianne Kaminsky at the Max Planck Institute, already knew the names of over 200 toys. Then, researchers tried something harder. They placed one unfamiliar toy among 7 familiar ones and asked Rico, using a word he had never heard, to fetch it. Rico chose correctly 7 times out of 10, reasoning, it seemed, that an unfamiliar word must belong to the one unfamiliar object in the room. Psychologists call this fast mapping.
In children, it's one of the engines behind an early vocabulary explosion. Some scientists have pushed back on that comparison. A closer look suggests Rico may have solved the puzzle through careful exclusion, rather than truly linking a word to a concept the way a toddler does. 7 years later, a second border collie went further still. Her name was Chaser. Trained for hours a day for years by retired psychologist John Pilley, Chaser eventually learned the names of 1,022 separate toys and could tell nouns from verbs.
Chaser's abilities took 9 years of deliberate, structured effort to build. Rico's may have relied on a shortcut dogs already carry naturally. Between the two of them sits a question science still hasn't closed. Is a dog's grasp of language something it's born with, or something we simply haven't tried hard enough to teach? Either way, the exact number of words was never really the point. The real discovery was that a dog could grasp the idea of a word at all.
A name is one thing. A feeling is another. Can a dog tell a happy voice from an angry one without ever being taught? In 2016, researchers Natalia Albuquerque and Daniel Mills at the University of Lincoln tried to find out, with a test that required no training at all. 17 dogs were shown 2 human faces side by side, one smiling, one angry, while a single human voice played from a hidden speaker. The dogs had never been taught what a smile means, or what anger sounds like. They didn't need to be. Again and again, the dogs looked longer at the face that matched the emotional tone of the voice, pairing a happy sound with a happy face, an angry sound with an angry one. The same effect appeared with dog faces, not just human ones. Something in a dog's mind treats emotion as a language that crosses the species line entirely. Other researchers, using brain scans at Eötvös Loránd University, found that a dog's auditory cortex responds differently to a familiar human language than to an unfamiliar one, and differently again to speech than to meaningless noise. None of this proves a dog understands our words, but it suggests something quieter, and in some ways stranger. A dog's brain sorts human voices in a way most animals never bother to.
Scientists are careful here. Noticing an emotional tone is not the same as feeling empathy for it. But recognizing a feeling is not the same as understanding a mind. A voice tells a dog how someone feels. It doesn't tell a dog what someone sees or knows or intends. That's a different kind of reading entirely. Can a dog tell what a person can and can't currently see? In 2003, at the Max Planck Institute, researchers forbade a dog from taking a piece of food lying in plain sight, then quietly changed who was watching over it. Sometimes the person kept her eyes locked on the dog. Sometimes she turned her back. Sometimes she closed her eyes. Sometimes she simply looked distressed. The dog's behavior shifted with every change. Watched, it approached carefully, indirectly, and sat rather than lay down. The moment the eyes turned away, or closed, or drifted elsewhere, the dog moved differently, faster, more directly, as if it understood exactly what being watched required. It wasn't the food that had changed. It was the dog's read on what the human could, or couldn't, currently see. A later study pushed the same idea into obedience itself. Dogs respond to a simple command differently, depending on whether their owner is actually paying attention while giving it. A sit from someone facing them, watching, lands differently than the same word from someone reading a book or turned away entirely. In 2015, researchers in Kyoto asked a sharper question still. Not whether dogs could read attention, but whether they could catch a lie. A person pointed to a container. Inside was food, exactly as promised. The same person pointed again, this time toward an empty one. The third time that person pointed, even toward a container that genuinely held food, the dogs simply stopped following.
A different, unfamiliar person, pointing at that same container, was still believed without hesitation. The dogs weren't rejecting the gesture. They were rejecting the source. More recent work pushes further, testing whether a dog can tell a person who is lying from one who is simply honestly wrong. In these experiments, dogs followed a misleading suggestion more readily from a human who genuinely seemed unaware the food had moved than from one who appeared to know exactly where it was and pointed elsewhere regardless.
Researchers are careful here. This isn't proof a dog understands another mind the way a child eventually does. But something in a dog appears to be doing more than watching a hand. It may be quietly asking what that hand's owner does or doesn't actually know. In 2019, anatomists Julianne Kaminsky and Anne Burrows dissected the faces of dogs and wolves, muscle by muscle. In almost every dog breed tested, they found a tiny muscle near the inner eyebrow. In wolves, again and again, it simply wasn't there.
Scientists call it the LOM. It does one very specific thing. It lifts the inner brow. Nothing else. The result is a face that looks unmistakably like sadness, or pleading, or a very particular kind of human infant.
Dogs don't use it constantly. They use it almost exclusively in the exact moment a human is looking back at them. It's difficult not to call this what it looks like, a face shaped, generation after generation, to be impossible to ignore. New evidence complicates the story slightly. Traces of this same muscle have turned up in coyotes and African wild dogs too. So perhaps it wasn't invented for us. Perhaps it was already there, waiting. And dogs simply learned how to use it at exactly the right moment. Between a face built to be read and a mind built to read intent, one question remains. How far does this reading go? Here the story turns, briefly, from psychology into a much older and far more uncertain history. Around 40,000 years ago, two human species shared the same Ice Age landscape. Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals. Only one of them is still here to tell the story. Anthropologist Pat Shipman noticed something small and strange: the whites of our eyes. Humans are the only primates with highly visible scleria, the pale ring that makes it easy to see exactly where someone is looking. Wolves, unusually among predators, share that same pale-eyed trait. Shipman's hypothesis is bold and admittedly unproven that early humans, paired with these gaze-readable wolf dogs, could coordinate a hunt in near total silence. If true, dogs weren't simply companions in that competition. They were something closer to technology, a silent communication system, walking on four legs. This is far from settled. Confirmed dog burials date to roughly 15,000 years ago, long after the Neanderthals were already gone. Older, disputed remains, sometimes called proto-dogs, may stretch back 35,000 years or more, but the claim remains genuinely contested. No one can prove a wolf dog helped drive our closest relatives into extinction. It's a mystery, not a conclusion, but it's enough to change how you look at the dog by your feet. A pointing finger read correctly, a glance understood as a greeting, a word learned in a single hearing. A liar recognized and never trusted again. None of this, on its own, proves a dog understands us the way we understand each other. Together, it forms a pattern too consistent to dismiss. Wolves became masters of surviving the wilderness, relying on nothing but themselves and each other. Dogs became masters of surviving us. Dogs may never understand our thoughts the way another person does, but perhaps they were never built to.
Evolution wasn't trying to build a second kind of human. It was building the one animal on Earth that could survive by understanding us just enough. A glance, a tone, a name, a lie. Maybe that's the real discovery here. Not that dogs became almost human, but that somewhere in that frozen world, we became the animal worth reading. The dog asleep across the room from you tonight already knew that, long before it could even walk.